A race extinguished twice over still lives in one place in Westeros, in the weirwood trees, in every carved face with red tears, in every dream dreamt beneath the canopy of a god's wood. The children of the forest left behind no books, no inscriptions, not a single stone with the name. And yet, their mark is deeper than that of any house with a sigil and a motto. Because long before the Starks coined the words, "Winter is coming," long before Aegon the Conqueror brought dragons across the narrow sea, there lived in these forests a people who forged the only truly honest peace in the history of Westeros. And those same people, in their desperation, created a weapon that nearly wiped all life from the face of the earth: the Others. A people who tried to defend themselves ended up creating a threat to their own survival. And today, we will trace this entire journey from the dawn of the world to the last keeper of memory, who now sits upon the throne in King's Landing. To understand the children of the forest, you must forget everything you know about the houses of Westeros. There is no lineage here, no blood inheritance, no ambition to build an empire. There is one central idea around which their entire existence is built: balance. The children themselves explain this through the mouth of Leaf when Bran asks her why there are so few of them. The gods gave them long lives, but not great numbers, so that they would not overrun the world like deer overrun a forest where there are no wolves to hunt them. This is not a random biological detail. It is the philosophy of an entire race, compressed into a single sentence. Think about this contrast. Humans multiply quickly, build cities, fell forests, mine ore, and expand. The children consciously remain few in number because they understand, if you take too much from the land will cease to provide. This is not a weakness. It is the choice of a race that lives for centuries and therefore sees further than any generation of men who are capable of thinking only as far as the horizon of their own lives. And therein lies the first deep contradiction that will haunt the children throughout their history. They are wiser than men in matters of long-term survival, and yet it is men with their short lives and narrow horizons who will ultimately wipe the children from the face of the earth. The children have no writing, no books, no parchments, no runic inscriptions on stone like the first men. Their history is passed down through song in the true tongue, which no human mouth can speak, and through the weirwood trees, through green sight, through memory literally embedded in the bark of a tree with a carved face. Consider what that means. The entire culture of a race exists only in two forms: oral tradition, which vanishes with the last speaker of the language, and in trees, which can be cut down. Their fragility is built into the very architecture of their memory. A human has a book that can be copied 1,000 times. The children have a single weirwood, and if it is cut down, it is not just a symbol that vanishes. The literal vessel of millennia of accumulated knowledge disappears. Outwardly, the children are nothing like the elven beauties of other fantasy universes. In the books, they are described as creatures no taller than a human child, with nut-brown skin modeled like a deer's, and golden or green eyes like a cat's, capable of seeing in the dark. They have 4 fingers with sharp black claws instead of nails. The first men called them children because their height deceptively resembled that of a child, and the giants called them Wo Dak Nak Gran, the little squirrel people, because the children were quick and loved the trees. But the children themselves called themselves those who sing the song of the earth, and in that name lies everything. They are not rulers, not warriors by nature, not empire builders. They are a part of the earth, speaking with its voice. Their weapons also reflect this philosophy. Dragon glass, obsidian weapons, made of volcanic glass harvested from the earth itself. Bows of weirwood, snares of woven grass. No metal, no smelting of ore, no industrial interference with nature. Every weapon of the children is an extension of the earth,
not an act of violence against it. And this will become important later when we talk about how their war with the first men ends. Because the children's technological lag behind the bronze weapons of the invaders will prove to be one of the deciding factors of the entire tragedy. Here is the first micro hint that will return to us much later. The children live long, see far, and yet their wisdom does not save them. Because wisdom is not equal to power, and power, in the end, decides who survives in Westeros. This is the first seed of the pattern that will run like a red thread through the entire history of this people.
All of this is just the showcase. What anyone who has opened a chapter on the children of the forest in an encyclopedia of the world sees. But behind this facade lies the story of a real war, real desperation, and a decision that still echoes through the world 12,000 years later. 12,000 years ago, if the legends of Westeros are to be believed, the first men arrived via the broken arm of Dorne, which was not yet broken in those days. They sailed from the eastern continent, leading horses, animals previously unknown to the children, which frightened them by their very appearance. They carried bronze weapons, shields, and a habit of clearing land for tillage. At first, the contact was peaceful as a first meeting between two completely different species of sentient beings can be. But the peace did not last long. The first men began to cut down trees, not just any trees, but heart trees, weirwoods with carved faces in which, the children believed, their gods, their ancestors, and their memories resided. To the first men, these were just trunks that hindered plowing. To the children, it was the desecration of a shrine and the literal murder of their ancestors whose consciousness lived in the bark. The children, fearing that the weirwoods were being used for espionage, began to destroy the settlements of the first men in retaliation, and so began a war that would last for nearly 2,000 years. It was a war between fundamentally unequal sides. The first men had bronze weapons. The children had obsidian and wood. The first men had the ability to breed faster than any animal in the forest, filling the land with their numbers. The children had long lives and magic, but a catastrophically small population, and this scarcity, which was once a philosophy of survival, turned into a death sentence in a war of attrition. And here, the second side of the children's power is revealed: magic. The children were capable of things the first men did not understand and feared. They could see through the eyes of ravens and beasts. Their sages, the green seers, saw the past, present, and future through the roots of the weirwoods. And, according to legend, they possessed something truly terrifying: the ability to bring down the hammer of the waters. This was magic capable of literally changing the geography of the continent. When the first men continued to advance across the Isthmus of Dorne, the desperate children used this power, bringing the waters down upon the broken arm itself, shattering it into the chain of islands known today as the Stepstones. The hammer of the waters did not stop the invasion. The first men were already on the mainland in sufficient numbers, and the attempt to cut off the supply route only temporarily slowed them down, at the cost of turning an entire region of the continent into an archipelago. This is the first major use of the children's magic against humans, and note the pattern that will repeat again and again in this history. Every time the children use their most terrible weapon, it does not bring a decisive victory. It brings only a reprieve and catastrophic side effects. The war dragged on for centuries. The legendary Brandon of the Bloody Blade killed dozens of children at Red Lake. The children sent wolves against human settlements. Both sides suffered losses that are difficult to even imagine in scale today. And gradually, both sides came to the same bitter conclusion: it is impossible to defeat one another. The first men are too numerous to be completely exterminated, no matter how strong the children's spells may be. The children know the forest too well and possess too much magic to be uprooted by military force in any reasonable amount of time.
remember this moment of equilibrium. It will be key to understanding the decision the children will make a little later, the decision for which we are gathered here today.
After nearly 2,000 years of war, both sides were exhausted to the limit. The chieftains and heroes of the first men and the elders of the children met on an island in the middle of a great lake known as the Eye of Gods. Here, the pact was signed. The children renounced all the open lands of Westeros in favor of men, keeping only the deep forests for themselves. The first men, in turn, swore an oath never to cut down heart trees again. In memory of this agreement, faces were carved into every tree on the island so that the gods would become witnesses to the treaty. That is why the island bears the name Isle of Faces. And here is the first key thesis, for which it is worth pausing and reflecting. This is the only truly sincere peace between conquerors and indigenous inhabitants in the history of A Song of Ice and Fire. Think about all the other conquests we know from the main saga. The Andals came and exterminated the first men south of the Neck, imposing their faith by force. Aegon the Conqueror came with dragons and burned those who refused to submit. The Dothraki enslave entire cities on the coast of Slaver's Bay. Everywhere cultures collide in this world, the outcome is the same. The strongest wins, and the weakest is either assimilated or exterminated. The pact on the Isle of Faces is an exception, not a victory of one side over the other, but a real compromise forged by two peoples who realized that mutual extermination would benefit no one. The first men adopted the gods of the children, the old gods, and this faith has survived to this day in the north of Westeros 12,000 years after its inception. This is an astonishing thing when you think about it. The religion of the invaders dissolved into the religion of those they once tried to wipe from the face of the earth. With the signing of the pact, the Age of Dawn ended and the Age of Heroes began, 4,000 years of relative peace between the two races. Great castles were built, houses were founded, and legendary figures like Brandon the Builder and Lan the Clever lived in this era, according to lore. It is a golden age of cooperation, which proves that the children of the forest were capable of living side by side with humans, not as enemies, but as neighbors sharing the same world. But here lies the first crack that would determine the fate of the children for millennia to come. The pact saved them from total annihilation by the first men, but it did not restore their lost numbers. The children were already few in number before the war by their very nature and philosophy of balance, and 2,000 years of bloodshed had thinned their already fragile population even further. They survived as a people, but there was no one to replace them, and their genetic resurgence was incomparably slower than the demographic growth of the humans, who continued to multiply, build, and expand. The children of the forest made peace and simultaneously signed their own slow death warrant, simply because time was now working against them in any scenario. With each passing century, the balance of power between the two races would shift further and further against the children. And this creates a terrifying foundation for what would happen thousands of years later when a new threat arrived, one more fearsome than any war with the first men. This is what they were like at the peak of their capabilities, having brokered a peace that any diplomat in human history would be proud of. And it is precisely because we understand the fragility of their position that the next chapter of this story becomes truly terrifying. About 2,000 years of relative peace after the signing of the pact, a catastrophe struck Westeros that has no equal in the continent's documented history: the Long Night. A winter that lasted a generation, a darkness in which the sun did not show itself for years. And along with this darkness came the others, beings from the furthest north, beings whose origin you are about to hear a version of, one that have split the fan community into two camps for many years. Before we get to the most controversial revelation, we must establish the firm canon. The others came from the north, bringing with them death and creatures raised from their graves, whites fighting on their side. The first men were dying by the kingdom. Their bronze blades proved useless against the icy warriors. Hope was fading until a legendary figure, known only as the last hero, set out for the uttermost north in search of the children of the forest to enlist their help. Upon finding them, he was able to unite the two peoples, and together, in the war for the dawn, the children and men drove the others back to the lands of always winter, from whence they came. This is the basic canon, common to both the books and the show. And now, we move to the part that literally split the universe into before and after. In the 6th season of the show, Bran Stark, while experiencing a vision of the past alongside Brynden Rivers, the last Greenseer, sees a scene that shocked millions of viewers. Leaf, one of the children, binds a captive first man to a weirwood tree and plunges a dragonglass dagger into his chest. The captive's eyes turn icy blue. Thus, the first other, the future Night King, was born on screen. When Bran asks Leaf in horror what she has done, she answers briefly and terrifyingly, "We were at war. We were being slaughtered. Our sacred trees were being cut down. We needed to protect ourselves from you, from men." Pause and grasp the scale of this revelation. The race that brokered the only honest peace in all of Westerosi history. The very race whose philosophy is built on balance and coexistence, in a moment of desperation when they were literally being exterminated, created a weapon that subsequently almost destroyed the entire world, including themselves. This is not just a plot twist. This is a tragedy in the most classical Greek sense of the word, the creator destroyed by its own creation. It is important to stop here and analyze the logic of this decision, because at first glance it seems absurd. Why create a creature capable of raising the dead into an army if you yourself are in the minority and losing your own in this war? The answer lies in a detail often missed when retelling this story. According to the world's reference materials, the children created the others as a weapon of extreme desperation against the first men, a last resort weapon capable of turning the humans' numerical superiority against them. If men die in battles with the children, their own corpses, raised by the magic of the others, swell the ranks of the army against their own kin. To turn the enemy's greatest advantage, their numbers, into their own ruin. But here is one of the most poignant details of this entire story. The children never actually used this weapon against the first men directly at full strength. Because peace was brokered before the weapon of extreme desperation they created was needed on a full scale. The pact on the Isle of Faces came before the children were forced to unleash the others against men in the open. This means that all the horror the others brought to the world thousands of years later was not part of the original plan. It was a side effect of a weapon created for one purpose, which then spiraled out of control and became a threat of an entirely different, much greater magnitude. Remember this moment. It will return to us when we speak about the finale of this story and the paradox that Martin embedded into the very idea of A Song of Ice and Fire. The others slipped out of their creator's control. The exact moment this happened remains unclear even to the historians of Westeros, but the logic is obvious. A creature capable of creating an army from the dead with a single touch, a creature with its own will and its own cold, alien logic, cannot remain a subservient weapon forever. At some point, the others ceased to be a tool of the children and became an independent force pursuing its own goal, incomprehensible to living beings, the total annihilation of all life. And here is where the second part of the tragedy unfolds, which directly answers the main question of this video. When the long night came and the others began their march south, they killed indiscriminately, not just the first men, not just the enemies of their creators, everyone, including the children of the forest themselves. A creature born from a race's desperate attempt to protect itself ultimately became a threat to its own survival, just as much as the enemy they were trying to defend against.
Think about the scale of this irony. The children created the others so that the first men would die and swell the army against themselves. Instead, they got a situation where the first men and the children alike were dying, and their corpses were equally swelling the army of the dead, which was now striking both races indiscriminately. A weapon conceived as an asymmetric strike against one specific enemy turned into an existential threat to all life on the continent, regardless of species, regardless of allies or enemies. This is precisely why, when the last hero came to seek the children's help against the others, the children did not hesitate to join the war against their own creation. It was not just a strategic necessity to forge an alliance with a former enemy against a new common foe. It was an admission of a catastrophic mistake. They had unleashed something into the world that now threatened to wipe everyone, including themselves, off the face of the earth.
The War for the Dawn became the culmination of this entire tragedy. The combined forces of the children and the first men, led by the last hero, fought against the others and their army of the dead in a battle whose scale is still shrouded in the mist of legend, because no written history of that era exists. The children supplied the nascent Night's Watch with dragonglass, the only weapon known at the time capable of killing the others. And in the end, after a long and bloody struggle, the others were driven back to the lands of Always Winter. But pay attention to one detail that is often missed when telling this story as an unambiguous victory. The others were not destroyed. They were merely pushed back, defeated, but not wiped off the face of the earth entirely. And according to legend, the children continued to supply the Night's Watch with 100 dragonglass daggers every year after the war, which directly points to one terrifying thought. They knew their creation was only defeated, not destroyed for good. They understood that one day the others might return. Think about what this means for the psychology of an entire race. The children of the forest lived out the rest of their history knowing that somewhere in the uttermost north, a threat they themselves had created was slumbering, a threat capable of one day waking up and descending upon the world again. Every year, as they handed over the blades to the Night's Watch, they were reminding themselves of their own catastrophic mistake of desperation. This is not just a historical event. This is a trauma woven into the very cultural memory of the race for millennia to come. After the War for the Dawn, a new period of relative peace began. The very age of heroes we spoke of earlier continued for several more millennia. But the children of the forest never recovered their former numbers. The war with men, then the war with their own creation, two catastrophes in a row left a deep mark on the already fragile population of a race that was never numerous, even in the best of times. The crises were behind them, or so it seemed, because the most destructive trial for the children of the forest was still ahead. And it did not come from the side of magic, nor from the side of the others, but from the side of ordinary human intolerance. 6,000 years ago, according to Westerosi chronology, new conquerors landed on the shores of the continent, the Andals, a tall, fair-haired people from the eastern continent, bringing with them not bronze, but steel, and a new faith, the faith of the Seven. And here is revealed one of the most bitter, ironic details of this whole story. The children of the forest survived nearly 2,000 years of war with the first men. They survived the catastrophe of their own creation, the others, and the War for the Dawn. They survived millennia of depletion following those wars. And yet, their final destruction came not from a magical threat, not from an ancient enemy, but from the ordinary religious intolerance of a new wave of conquerors armed with the best metal of their era. The Andals considered the magic of the children and the old gods themselves to be an abomination in the eyes of the Seven. This was not just a military expansion like that of the first men millennia earlier, who at least had an economic motive, land for farming. This was a targeted religious eradication. The Andals cut down sacred weirwood trees wherever they found them, except for the island where the pact was signed. They killed the children on sight, considering their very nature to be blasphemy. One of the most poignant and simultaneously cruel fragments of the Chronicles concerns a hill known today as High Heart, which was sacred to the children. An Andal king nicknamed Eric the Kinslayer cut down an entire grove of 31 weirwood trees there. Think about that number. 31 trees, 31 particles of the literal physical memory of a race, erased by a single order from a single man. And now, the final, perhaps most brutal phrase in this entire history. The Chronicles state it plainly. The first men killed half the children of the forest with bronze blades, and the Andals finished the job with iron. Think about the cold, mechanical precision of that phrasing. Not a metaphor, not a legend, but a literal historical outcome. A race that once forged the only sincere peace in the history of the continent was exterminated by two successive waves of conquerors, each using more advanced weaponry than the last. The few who survived fled to the far north, beyond the wall, where the Andals would never follow them. The northern houses of the first men, especially the Starks, managed to halt the Andal invasion at the neck, at Moat Cailin, and that is why the old gods survived in the north of Westeros, while further south they were almost universally displaced by the faith of the Seven. But the children themselves, as a physical race, as a living people, ceased to exist within the sight of men. By the time of Aegon Targaryen's conquest, 300 years before the events of the main saga, there had been no contact with the children of the forest for thousands of years. The maesters of the Citadel either considered them completely extinct or, even more bitterly, doubted they had ever existed at all, turning an entire sentient race into a semi-myth, a nursery tale told by the fireside. And now, let's look at how this legacy manifested in the people you know well, because the children of the forest formally vanished from the history of Westeros, but their influence, their blood, their magic, and their tragedy continue to live on in the characters driving the plot of the main saga thousands of years later. When Bran Stark heads beyond the wall in search of the three-eyed raven, he is, without knowing it, repeating the path of the last hero from legend, who thousands of years ago sought the children's help against the others. Only this time, the circumstances are different. Bran is not looking for an army of allies against a threat. He is looking for the last surviving keepers of knowledge, the last bearers of the memory of a race that humanity had practically wiped from the face of the earth. And here, the show and the books provide us with fundamentally different depths of exploration, and this difference is extremely important. In the show, Bran discovers a handful of surviving children in the cave of the Three-Eyed Raven, among them Leaf, who is capable of speaking the common tongue. It is she, as we have already discussed, who reveals the origin of the others to Bran, and it is she who ultimately sacrifices herself, covering the retreat of Bran and Mira from the advancing Whites by blowing up the last stronghold of her race with an explosive device. The last known child of the forest dies protecting a human, a descendant of the very people who once exterminated her kind. Stop for a second and appreciate this image. A race destroyed by two waves of human conquest, whose last living incarnation sacrifices her own life to save a human. This is not a random script detail. It is the final, ultimate manifestation of the very philosophy with which we began this analysis. The children of the forest knew how to make peace even with those who had caused them unimaginable grief. Their last act in the history known to us is an act of self-sacrifice for the sake of someone else's child. The book version remains much more closed and unspoken, and here I must be as honest as possible with you. In the books, at the time of the 5th volume, A Dance with Dragons, Leave does indeed exist, and she does indeed answer Bran's question about where the rest of her people went with a phrase that has become one of the most atmospheric quotes in the entire saga. Gone down into the earth, into the stones, into the trees. But the books nowhere explicitly confirm that it was the children who created the others. This is a critically important distinction that is worth stating separately and as honestly as possible, because many fans of the saga mistakenly project the show's revelation onto the book canon as if it were already a proven fact. The supplementary material, The World of Ice and Fire, only touches on the topic in passing, without specifics about the origin of the others. When asked directly by fans if there is a closer connection between the others and the children than previously thought, George R.R. Martin replied that it is possible and that the topic will be explored later in the saga. This is not a confirmation. It is not a refutation either. It is the intentional ambiguity of an author who is clearly holding back one of the most important secrets of his universe for the remaining, yet-to-be-published volumes. This means that the version of the children as the creators of the others, for all its powerful symbolic logic, remains officially confirmed only within the framework of the show's canon and remains a theory in relation to the books. A very convincing theory, supported by circumstantial details, by the fact that the children are the only ones who possess weapons effective against the others, and by the fact that the children clearly knew much more about the origin of the others than anyone else in the world, but still a theory, not a recorded fact of the text. And, what is especially interesting, there is no direct equivalent in the books to the Night King as a single leader of the others, which means that the final book explanation for the origin of this threat will almost certainly differ from the show's, perhaps quite significantly. But even if the book version ultimately turns out to be different, the thematic logic established by the show is too elegant to be accidental. A race that built its entire philosophy on balance, in a moment of despair, breaks that balance with its own hands and creates a force it can no longer control. This resonates too precisely with the central theme of the entire saga, a theme that Martin himself has emphasized repeatedly. Power corrupts even those who take it for the sake of protection rather than for conquest. We have traced the path of this people from the dawn of time to their near total disappearance, but there is something else, something hidden deeper than the events and decisions we have already analyzed. The weirwood is not just a decorative element of a fantasy world. It is perhaps the most meaningful symbol in the entire saga. And understanding its nature opens the door to understanding why the children of the forest felt the loss of their sacred groves so acutely as an existential threat to their own existence. Think about it from the perspective of a race without a written language. Humans have libraries. If one book burns, another copy remains. If one library is destroyed, the knowledge is preserved in another. Human memory is distributed, duplicated, and protected by the very nature of written language. The children of the forest had no such protection. Their memory was literally embedded in the living tissue of specific trees. To cut down a weirwood did not just mean destroying a religious symbol. It meant physically erasing a portion of the race's collective memory that existed nowhere else in a duplicated form. This is why the children's reaction to the felling of weirwoods by the first men was so violent that it escalated into a nearly 2,000-year war. From a human perspective, it might have seemed like a disproportionate reaction to clearing land for farming. From the perspective of the children, it was equivalent to invaders methodically burning the only surviving copies of all the history, all the culture, and all the wisdom of your people without even understanding what they were doing, considering it merely practical land clearing. Here it is worth mentioning a theory that remains just a theory without official confirmation, but which builds a surprisingly cohesive picture if you look closer. Some researchers of the saga believe that the old gods themselves, whom the first men and northern houses still worship, are not abstract nature spirits, but literally the children of the forest themselves, or more precisely, their greenseers, whose consciousness continues to exist in the root systems of the weirwoods after death. If this theory is correct, then the worship of the old gods is, in essence, a form of continuous dialogue between living humans and long-dead children, whose consciousness is literally dissolved into the forests of the north. I emphasize again, this is not confirmed canon, but one of the most popular interpretations, relying on scattered hints in the text, but the logic of this theory explains with surprising grace why the northern weirwoods proved so resistant to centuries of religious persecution by the faith of the Seven. There is one more detail that deserves special attention. The books state directly that the children had no metal, no weaving in the human sense, and no cities. They lived in complete harmony with the natural cycle, building nothing that went beyond what the earth could provide naturally. And yet, this was the race that possessed magic capable of breaking an entire continent in half, the hammer of the waters, and magic capable of creating a creature that nearly destroyed the entire world. A paradox of primitivism and power simultaneously, which Martin incorporates quite intentionally, contrasting the technological simplicity of the children with their colossal magical strength. At least one fact that most viewers truly do not know concerns the origin of the word the children use for themselves, those who sing the song of the earth. Not warriors, not rulers, not builders, singers. A race whose main function in the world, according to their own self-definition, is not conquest or construction, but to sing, to maintain the harmony of the world through song and memory. And it is this race, singers by self-designation, who, in a moment of despair, created the most destructive weapon Westeros has ever seen. The contrast between the peaceful self-identification of the race and the catastrophic outcome of their only act of military desperation is perhaps the most painful detail of this whole story if you think about it truly deeply. Now that we have traveled this entire path, from the golden age of the Pact to near total extermination, one final question remains, for which it was perhaps worth telling this story at all. What happens to the memory of a race that has no written language after the last living bearer of that memory disappears? The answer to this question is contained in the most unexpected place in the main saga, in the fate of Bran Stark. Remember how Bran's story ends in the show? He does not become a warrior. He does not lead armies. He becomes the three-eyed raven, a being in whom is concentrated literally all the memory of the world of men, and, what is especially important for our topic today, all the memory of the world of the children of the forest as well. When the Night King seeks to kill Bran specifically, his motivation, according to the direct explanation in the show, is not personal revenge, but a desire to erase the very memory of the existence of all living things. If Bran dies, it is not just one person who disappears. The last keeper of knowledge about who the children of the forest were, what they did, and what they went through disappears as well. Consider the terrifying symmetry of this situation. The White Walkers were created by the children of the forest as a weapon intended to protect their memory, their sacred trees, and their very existence. And at the very end of the saga, it is a descendant of the others, the Night King, who attempts to destroy the last keeper of that same memory that the children originally sought to protect by creating their weapon of despair. It is a closed circle in which a weapon born to preserve the cultural memory of a race ultimately becomes the primary threat to that very memory. When Bran Stark becomes King of the Six Kingdoms in the series finale, many viewers perceived this decision as unexpected, even strange. Why place a character on the throne who is devoid of personal ambition, emotions, and human warmth in the conventional sense? But if you look at this choice through the lens of the entire history we have just analyzed, the logic becomes significantly deeper. The Council of Westeros, without fully realizing it, is not just choosing a man with unique abilities for the throne. They are choosing a living continuation of the tradition of the Children of the Forest, the only being in the modern world capable of seeing all of history in its entirety, without distortions, without gaps, and without oblivion. Bran Stark becomes what the Green Seers of the Children of the Forest were millennia ago, a keeper of memory, bound to a weirwood, seeing the past, present, and future simultaneously. A race that left no written chronicles behind, ultimately passed on its primary function, the function of being the world's memory, to a human, a descendant of the very conquerors who exterminated them. This is not just a beautiful metaphor by the writers, it is the completion of an arc that began in the Age of Dawn, an arc about how cultural memory, once passed on through the right vessel, is capable of surviving even the extinction of the entire people who created it. And here lies the final, most painful paradox of this entire story. The Children of the Forest vanished as a living, breathing race. They no longer exist in Westeros as a distinct people with their own culture, language, and traditions in a living, evolving form. But their greatest legacy? The understanding that the world requires balance, that memory is more important than conquest, and that wisdom lies not in the accumulation of power, but in the ability to see the consequences of one's decisions millennia into the future. This legacy has outlived the race itself and is now embodied in the man sitting on the Iron Throne, or rather, in the chair that replaced the melted throne. If you were to ask me what the main lesson of the Children of the Forest's history is, I would say it is a story about the price of despair. Not about villainy, not about cruelty for the sake of cruelty, but specifically about despair. A race that built its philosophy on patience and balance, at the moment it was being literally exterminated alive, made a decision dictated not by malice, but by a pure animalistic desire to survive at any cost. And that cost proved monstrous, not only for those against whom the weapon was created, but for the creators themselves, and ultimately for nearly the entire living world. Here, I should state my position as clearly as possible, because I believe this story deserves an honest assessment rather than a neutral shrug. I do not think the Children of the Forest deserve condemnation for creating the White Walkers. Put yourself in their place. A race on the verge of extinction, technologically inferior to its opponent, possessing only magic as its sole advantage. In such a situation, creating an asymmetric weapon of last resort is not villainy. It is a survival instinct pushed to the limit of despair. The tragedy is not that the children made this choice. The tragedy is that they could not maintain control over their own creation, and that the consequences of that loss of control stretched for thousands of years and affected the whole world, including themselves. Remember where we started this analysis. The only race to conclude a true peace with the conquerors through the Pact on the Isle of Faces ultimately created a threat that, 8,000 years later, nearly destroyed those they were trying to protect, and the children themselves too. Now, after everything we have analyzed, this phrasing takes on a much deeper, much more bitter meaning. It is not just irony of fate, it is a pattern woven into the very nature of desperate decisions. A weapon created in a moment of panic rarely remains under its creator's control, and the price of that loss of control almost always proves to be higher than the price of the initial threat they were trying to defend against. The Children of the Forest deserve to be remembered, not as creators of monsters, but as a people who twice tried to survive against an overwhelming force, once through war and magic, and a second time, unsuccessfully, against religious intolerance that had nothing but steel and fanaticism. A people who, despite their own tragedy, still managed to pass on their greatest legacy through the millennia, through the old gods, through the weirwoods, and finally, through the only human capable of carrying their memory forward into a future that the children themselves will never see. Winter is coming, the Starks say. But long before those words became the motto of a northern house, there was a race that knew more about the true cost of winter than anyone in the world of men. A race that sang the song of the earth while the earth still wanted to listen to them. The children of the forest no longer sing, but their song, passed on through the tree, through the blood, through the memory of one boy who fell from a tower and became something much greater than a boy, still sounds. And perhaps that is the only true victory that a race, exterminated twice over, still managed to achieve. What do you think? Did the children of the forest deserve the ending they got? Or does this whole story, in the end, only confirm that in this world, wisdom is never a sufficient defense against someone else's cruelty? Write your opinion in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss the next analysis.